So we live in a disruptive age, and the State of the Church report talks about a lot of elements of disruption. What else have you seen disrupted over the last few decades in New York City and in culture?
Well, one of the things, of course, is that the most disruptive thing is that there were always a kind of how do I say it? There was always a small number of evangelical and maybe conservative Catholics who were very devout, and they had, Christian. They were very devoutly Christian, but they also had Christian ethics. So they, Christian view of morality and sexuality and things like that. That's maybe 20%. Then there was 80% of the population who were nominal Christians. Maybe they went to church on Christmas and Easter. They said they were Methodist or Presbyterian or Catholic, but it wasn't very deep. And yet they actually held the Christian views too. And that was the reason I'm making these strange gestures is they were like an umbrella.
Okay.
They were a shelter, because to be an Orthodox evangelical or Catholic and to have all these views of things didn't look that weird. Because 70-80% of the population had the same view of marriage and sexuality and things like that. But when that has gone away, what's going away is inherited religion is dying, not chosen religion. Not religion based on conversion, but inherited religion where you're born into it. My family's Methodist, I went to church growing up. That's just going away. Young people say, unless I choose it, it's not. Nobody can choose my religion for me. So the idea that you're born into a Catholic family or a Presbyterian family is going away, and that's the reason why the main line and the Catholic Church is just collapsing. And so what you have is these devout people are pretty much the same number of really devout Christians, but now they look really weird. And in fact, they look dangerous and strange. Because, you see what I mean, that protective covering's gone. And that means more ostracism, more strangeness, more estrangedness from the culture. That's the big thing that's happening, I think, right now.
When you look into the future, is there anything that you can see on the radar that you're like, hey, leaders, pay attention to this?
Well, the political polarization, yes. Okay, here's where I would go. The political polarization that's happening now is a major challenge for churches because here's my reading of the Bible. My reading of the Bible says that Christians ought to be sold out for racial justice. So all races are equal, all in the image of God. They should be deeply concerned about the poor and the marginalized. They should be pro-life, and they should believe, at least for Christians, that the sex should only be between a man and a woman in marriage. Okay? Now, those four things, that the early church was marked by them, we know that. Okay? Two of those look very conservative. Two of those look very liberal. And so right now what's happening is, since those four things are never combined in any political party, they're not combined in any other institution other than Catholic social teaching and, biblical Christianity. And so what happens is there's enormous pressure everywhere in the country for churches to major in two of them and get quiet about two of them. So in New York, huge pressure for the churches in New York City to talk about racial justice and caring about the poor. Everybody applauds, but if you say we're pro-life or we think sex should be only between a man and a woman in marriage, people are going to pick at you.
Yeah.
I would say in the middle of Alabama, if an evangelical pastor starts to preach about all four of those things, a lot of the people are going to get nervous about the racial justice and poverty thing and say, that sounds kind of liberal, that sounds kind of like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? And so I don't know anywhere where it seems to me like there's a kind of red evangelicalism and a blue evangelicalism, and almost everywhere I see people like play up two of those and play down two of those, or even actually stop believing in two of those.
Right.
And that's because there's this enormous these are package deals. The political parties say you can't have them together. You have to, in other words, to be a Democrat or be a Republican, for example, be Fox News or MSNBC, you just can't keep those things together. And yet, And so that is, to me, the biggest challenge for Christian leaders. How do you be committed to the whole range? That's the early church. It's biblical.
So all four of those, Tim, have been, I think, hallmarks of Redeemer, at least to the extent that I've been able to access hundreds of your sermons over the years, and your writing and your preaching. How have you held that tension in New York?
Well, it hasn't been easy. I mean, there are occasions, I have definitely seen people get up in the middle of sermons and walk out,
Yeah.
which is always a little bit satisfying. Because when you see that, you do say, all right, okay, I'm not a total coward here. I mean, because, see, here's the thing. I do think you have to care about context.
Yeah.
Which means, for example, is you don't want to pat yourself on the back and say, I'm valiant for truth because I'm preaching against abortion every month.
Right.
There are certainly people who criticize me for not preaching about abortion constantly. And I do say, all right, look, if I have non-Christians coming to church, I don't want them to get hit over the head with something that I know that they're going to be offended by within the first 2 weeks they come. So am I going to be careful about my context? Am I going to realize what offends people and what attracts people? Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that if I was in Alabama, I'm in the middle of New York City, I wouldn't preach identically. I wouldn't be reaching non-Christians the same way. Nevertheless, what you have to do to your leaders constantly is, at least your leaders, you have to say, we cannot get cold feet on any of this. I mean, there is no biblical warrant. I mean, here in here I'd have to say, you all get excited about what the Bible says about justice, and you don't get excited about what the Bible says about sexuality. At that point, you're really not letting the Bible animate you; you're letting the culture animate you. And you've just got to immerse yourself in the Word because they go together. By the way, there's one. I think it's Amos chapter 2, verse 7, where it says, "A father and a son go into the same woman, and they sell the poor for a pair of shoes." So one verse, sexual sin and economic injustice, the Bible sees it as a whole cloth. They go together. And we live in a culture that just tries to rip that apart.